the spending is extremely real, and it's often invisible in the budget. You're not budgeting this as much. Staff time training on review, technology platforms with automatic post-visit review sequences. Now we have all this AI stuff that goes into your phone that automatically asks you all of these kinds of things. And for a multi-site operator, man, that adds up fast. And keep in mind, all the SaaS software providers, how do they make more money? The same customers adding additional APIs that allow you to do more functions is how.
All right. Most healthcare businesses have a number they're proud of, a number they show off, a number they track, a number they think proves they're doing good work. Larry's argument in his latest article, that number might be completely meaningless. Today, we're talking about one of the most visible metrics in healthcare, Google reviews, 5 stars, 0 outcomes. Welcome to The Operator, a show about running better healthcare businesses, not from theory, from people actually doing the work. If you're responsible for patients, people, or performance, this is for you. Larry, welcome to your show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for hosting my show.
Well, my job is to sort of set you up. This is the last part in a series that you've been doing. And if people want to go back to it, we'll give the link to the Substack that they can view, as well as the articles on LinkedIn. But first, why did you decide to do sort of a series on metrics? Like, what about that made you say, I'm going to dedicate several weeks of my writing to just metrics in general before we get into the specific Google reviews?
Yeah. What we tend to do in an operating business and healthcare platforms is we tend to get very routinized on certain metrics that are like sacred cows. They're the belief that they are the most important ones. And we've had vast changes in our operating environment. If you think of sort of the post-COVID hangover days, then you had shortages and you had all the headwinds of reimbursement and all the things around high inflation. And the business models have had to change. You've had to adjust. And so what we tend not to do in healthcare operations is rethink, challenge our assumptions, and say, why are we continuing to measure that? And then the objective becomes the measurement rather than the activities and the behaviors that really get the operations flowing in the right direction. And so I've tried to, on each one of these metrics, doesn't mean, as I point out in the articles, that you shouldn't be measuring them, but you should be understanding how they've shifted over the years. Right. And the whole area around Goodhart's is a bias that we tend to default in over time if we're not careful.
Yeah, when the metric becomes the measure, it fails to measure what matters, is the thing that kept sticking with me. That makes sense. I mean, your Russian, if you want to go back and read it, the Russian nail factory sort of highlights that pretty well. When you tell me to gamify, when you gamify a metric and you put my salary on the line for that, guess what I get really good at? Hitting that number. Is it the letter of the metric or the spirit of the metric? Well, I hit the letter of the metric, and that's what gets me the paycheck.
Yeah, just to that point, years ago, I'm going back into the late 80s. I had a few clinics, and one of my clinics, we used to measure no-show cancellation rate and used to incentivize the front desk person for a lower no-show cancellation rate. And interesting, she went on maternity leave, and she was a wonderful, intake coordinator, receptionist, what we called DOFI at the time, director of first impressions. And all of a sudden, our no-show cancellation went sky high. And I started wondering, how is that the case? Well, as it turns out, you can game that number. It's no different than the Russian nail factory. Mm-hmm. Somebody cancels, you just take them off the schedule and put them somewhere else, and you never were able to see what really happened there. And so gamesmanship, working around it, our tax laws are the absolute, personification of Goodhart's law. Everybody works around the tax laws to try and save on their taxes. That's normal.
Yep.
And so we have to, we have too many tax law issues and Goodhart issues in operation. Yep. And so my challenge as somebody who's in the field every day operating is for us to challenge those assumptions.
And you can tell which side of the argument someone is on with taxes when they call it a write-off or a loophole. If it's a loophole, you can tell they don't agree with it right there. All right, so let's jump into this. Yeah. If someone logs on, Google website, somewhere where ratings are being tabulated and shown off, what does a 4.9 out of 5 star rating actually tell you about specifically a healthcare business?
Yeah, honestly, it tells you that they're good at asking. That's not nothing.
Right.
Not what most operators think it is. 4.9 means your patients felt well enough to leave a review that had a positive enough experience to give you close to a 5-star. Does not tell you about the patient who dropped off after the 2 to 3 visit cliff in physical therapy, or in dental. It doesn't tell you the patient who didn't show up for the second visit, which oftentimes in dental is the most important visit from an economic standpoint. It doesn't tell you about your 22-day wait period for a new evaluation. It doesn't tell you whether your functional outcomes improved or whether your hygiene appointment rate is collapsing. It's a sentiment snapshot from a very self-directed audience. And in healthcare, that audience skews very grateful, skews compliant, skews towards the people who finished care, the people who like you. The 4.9 is real. It's just not the whole story. It might not even be the important or really key elements of the story.
Yeah, you want to gamify that number. Don't point out where to scan the QR code to leave a review to somebody who's disgruntled, right? And that, although you can look at the other side of the argument, which is sometimes when people have a bad experience, they're more likely to go rate you and leave a review versus the people who are the silent, happy, satisfied customer or patient.
Exactly. And it has some meaning. It's just not all that much important from the day-to-day operations.
Right. So at what point did healthcare cross the line from measuring experience to pretending experience equals quality?
Yeah, so we got to go back a little bit in place of time. In the, call it the late 80s, early 90s, there was this new thing that happened in healthcare called functional outcome measures. SF12, the SF36, short form, long form 36, which is the healthcare quality of life. And so we started to say, what do outcomes mean? And outcomes were defined as days, dollars, utilization, functional outcome, and on top of that, we had patient satisfaction, later becoming patient experience. And so the combination of days, dollars, or sort of utilization-driven data, clinical functional outcome-driven data, and all the things around the experience became sort of the 3 distinct domains. But what happened is over time, we've tried to simplify it. We're in business and operations. We're always trying to make the complex simple from an operation standpoint. That's a great thing. However, sometimes when we make things so simple, we destroy what the animal that we're trying to create is. So the moment we ran out of better alternatives and stopped admitting it, clinical outcome measurements in the most outpatient settings is inconsistent at best, absent at worst. Functional tools do exist, photo, promise, all the things around Medicare, PSFS, for example, but adoption is not, is not evenly put. And at times we tend to only do it on our best patients or those who complete care. And so you have to be really, really careful. And so what fills that volume, whatever is visible, and Google stars are everywhere. And so let's use Google stars. I had a series a couple of weeks ago about Net Promoter Score, a lot of similarities here. They're on your profile. They show up in the listing. They're a number. Numbers feel like data. So we promote them, not because anyone made a deliberate decision about it, but that 4.9 stars equals clinical excellence. Somehow or another, we conflated that. But because the infrastructure for measuring actual clinical excellence wasn't there or wasn't fulsome or wasn't complete, the proxy became the point. And that's always how it happens. We make a proxy a conclusion, and Google stars are now that conclusion, unfortunately.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up 4.9 stars, and I think I know why. To me, 5 feels too perfect. It feels like I can't trust that because nothing's perfect. So 4.9 feels as close as you can get, really good, but obviously there's some real in there, so it matters. Isn't that funny? How that, like, we've even on the receiving end said 5's too good, I don't trust it. A 4.8, that 4.9, that feels more
authentic. Feels more
authentic. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. So you mentioned like the pre-COVID, right? So are operators still chasing Google reviews based on a version of the algorithm that doesn't actually exist? Are we still having a 2016 mindset in 2026?
No, that's absolutely right. A lot of them are. And that's really what my research started to show, that the old mental model was pretty simple. More 5-star reviews equals higher ranking equals more patients. So it was all driven by how high on the Google best search engine, period. It's interesting. We're switching now from search engine to AI, LLM.
Agentic search, yeah.
And for a while, the volume of reviews was the dominant SEO signal. And this really is the main teaching point of the article. So that logic held true, but the algorithm has gotten way more sophisticated, as they always do. Technology always outpaces everything we do in healthcare. Yep. Proximity, relevance, behavior signals, how people interact with your listing, whether they click, whether they call, these matter now as well. So it's the behavioral elements, not just the star elements. Review recency matters more than raw volume. So if you took 100 reviews, it's like a golf handicap system. It's the 5 top most recent ones that really matter. Right. So the operators who ran an aggressive, let's get to 200 review campaigns, I still see this all the time in things. They sort of stop. They're potentially losing ground to a competitor with 80 reviews. So that was kind of like, I got 200, you got 80, so therefore I'm better. In fact, our competitiveness around Google stars surpassed our competitiveness around clinical excellence and doing the right thing for the patient, right? You know, we got diverted by all this. So chasing the number at one time made sense. Now it's table stakes, and the operators treating it like it's a competitive moat are, you know, probably optimizing for a version of local search that's already moved way past them. By the way, at least in physical therapy, why do we care about local search much? Don't we have plenty of patients now, plenty of volume. Yeah. You know, really optimizing, as we talked about last week, optimizing that volume and not the churn is really important. So keeping the patients you have, and what we say in Kentucky, milking your own cows first. You have those patients, make sure you're getting the treatment completion on them so that you can focus attention on there. And that's where that, you know, really being extremely intentional about visit 2 and 3 and showing value there rather than routinize the visit. What you're basically saying to the patient is, you don't need to come in anymore because we're going to do the same thing every time.
Yep. I can actually hear someone creating a KPI just for that, but isn't there one? Isn't it churn? So when you don't have real clinical outcome data, what does fill that gap? What is the right thing or the better thing to measure?
Yeah, you know, so what happens is we use Google stars and net promoter scores because leadership needs something to say in a board deck. And this is a different topic for another time, but I think, you know, PE-backed platforms and even private practices do not have the right type of board members. They have people playing by old rules of an old game. Call it college before we professionalize through revenue share and NIL. That's the type of people that are on boards right now. Is this new game that took place post-COVID. You show me an operator who's really done well the last few years, and you've got an operator, because they're the ones who've dealt with incredible amounts of inflation at the supply level, inflation at the compensation level, shortages of your suppliers, all of those kinds of things. And so we use Google stars and net promoter scores for those board members because we want to fill a board deck. It sounds cynical, but it's accurate. Organizations under performance pressure from either PE owners, from franchise benchmarks, from year over year, need visible proof of quality. And so this proxy of Google stars is now what your compliance is showing up as quality. And if you can't pull functional improvement data, it's very hard to do, as you know. If your outcome tool adoption is inconsistent, it's very hard to be consistent. If your discharge documentation is a mess, very hard to have that consistent as well, because as most patients don't read their end of treatment discharge. You reach the number you have. Google stars makes it easy. Net promoter scores make it easier. Patient satisfaction makes it easier. Those aren't bad metrics. They're just getting asked to carry weight they weren't built for. The danger isn't that operators track them. The danger is that over time, the proxy becomes the definition. You stop asking, are patients getting better, and start asking, are patients happy enough to leave a 5-star review? That's
different.
Entirely different dimensions. They're related, but they're not the same questions.
Yeah. You highlighted something in this article that I guess I didn't think about too much, and I bet you a lot of people didn't either, which is responding to one of these reviews, if it's negative or in a way, could open you up to liability. So why are healthcare providers the only businesses that really can't actually defend themselves in public, or they can, but they have to be really, really careful about it?
Yeah. So first of all, the reviews tend to reflect sort of your interpersonal and logistical experience, your friendliness, your wait times, your parking, the front desk, not clinical decision making.
Right.
And so the population leaving reviews is really not a representative, population. The people are complex. They leave incomplete. Survey data, disappointing outcomes are less likely to review stars of any nature at all. And what ends up happening is do you like your provider? All those kind of things. They review it, but that selection bias is baked into every star rating in the industry. But the biggest thing is what you're referring to on the question, which has HIPAA in the background, which limits how providers can respond to negative reviews. You can't get into details. You can't correct the record. You can't explain context. So 1-star review about a billing dispute sits on your profile essentially unchallenged because your response has to be generic. It immediately lands, and people ignore that. And so now we've developed this whole niche industry about how to respond to bad reviews. It's almost like all of us need our own PR crisis firm when we get a bad review. We also have to remember, I always used to tell my therapist this in the PT side, and I say the same thing in the dental. If a patient left your local clinic because they refused to accept some level of self-responsibility in physical therapy that manifests itself by a home program or compliance with instructions, and in dental, it manifests itself with compliance with instructions on hygiene care and other aspects of post-procedural care. And they would not take, and therefore they disliked you because they wanted to put all their problems onto you. It's okay to fire a customer every once in a while. And if that customer leaves you a bad review, you could still sleep at night, because self-responsibility and an active role in your own healthcare, your own recovery, and in your own in the dental world, in your own treatment is critical. A lot of patients don't want to assume any responsibility, and they might write you a bad review. You can't get overly intrusive on it because you could be violating HIPAA.
Yeah, it's the juice versus squeeze ratio. How you might chase after and put so much effort in this one patient, you're probably never going to make that. You might never make that person happy. Let's take that juice versus squeeze ratio over to this question, because this takes time, effort, money. There are firms who you can hire that are specialized in this. So what are people actually spending? Even if you're not hiring a firm, you're also spending brain power, time, staff time, effort, money. What are we actually spending to maintain that 4.9? And has anyone proven that it does anything? Does it drive business or patient growth at all?
Yeah. So one of the questions I ask operators to think about is the concept of what is your return on the cost of quality? The cost is the time, effort, resources, money, all these things we do to ensure some level of quality. And so you have to be cognizant of that. The spending is extremely real, and it's often invisible in the budget. You're not budgeting this as much. Staff time training on review, technology platforms with automatic post-visit review sequences. Now we have all this AI stuff that goes into your phone that automatically asks you all of these kinds of things. And for a multi-site operator, man, that adds up fast. And keep in mind, all the SaaS software providers, how do they make more money? The same customers adding additional APIs that allow you to do more functions is how they make more money. We'll talk about the EMRs and other kind of things later, because all they are is miniature versions. So now I'm not only doing your EMR, I'm doing your point of service, pay at times. I'm doing your outcome studies. I'm doing your documentation AI. All of these things keep adding costs. And so we say as operators, what's my cost of RCM? Should be going down. All of a sudden it's going up. Why is it going up? Because all these providers are adding APIs that are increasing your cost, and you have to do the tough decisions and make choices about all of those kinds of things. And so in healthcare, a lot of choice is constrained. Insurance networks, referral patterns, geography, they're still doing an incredible amount of routing. And so if you're investing to maintain a 4.9 in a market where a meaningful portion of your new patients are coming through other referral channels that aren't looking at your Google rating at all, that doesn't mean the investment is wasted. It just means the ROI calculation is messy. Than the platform selling requested. So we see all of these efforts now in the AI world of lead generation and all of these things around it. And I talk to practices and they say, I'm not having trouble getting new patients right now. Well, you're spending an incredible amount between your foot marketers, your advertising, your digital marketing, and all of these things have accreted to a level, and you have to say, does the business model support it anymore? And in healthcare, it's a penny nickel business, a nickel dime business. You can't afford to spend an enormous amount of money on a problem that you think is there, but it really isn't.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to hold your feet to the fire. I actually put your article into test. And I said, hey, how would some leading brands actually optimize this? And one of the best responses was Disney. They said Walt Disney himself would optimize for smiles per hour, not miles per hour, not stars. So if Google stars don't tell the truth, what should operators be measuring instead?
Yeah, so we'll get into this a little bit, but I noticed one of the comments from the article, last week was somebody saying the best metric they measure is how many smiles are leaving their clinic, and I thought that was a real interesting one. In dental, at least in our company, we say our mission is to create a lifetime of healthy smiles, and how are we doing that? And doing meaningful, purposeful work, and remembering. In fact, that's what we're here for. But there's a short list with teeth. New patient arrival rate is a real critical one. Are new patients choosing you? Is that number growing? Is your number of new patients growing? We talk about growth in organic and all these things in platforms, and most PT operators measure that wrong. They measure growth in terms of, number of visits per patient, all kinds of things. They ought to be measuring it by growth and cash flow. Different topic for another time. But is the number growing? That's a market signal, not just a sentimental drop. Plan of care completion, very, very difficult, but really, really, really difficult. Our patients stay in through their episode of completion. To me, that would be the best proxy of patient, satisfaction, really, because dropout is the quiet killer that a 4.9 doesn't capture, right? Mm-hmm. Functional outcome improvement, discipline specific, systematically collected, not cherry picked. Reactivation rate, our former patients coming back when they have a new need. I call it friends, family, and former patient percentage. What percentage of your new patients fall into that bucket? That is really critical to me, because it means you're spending $0 under than what you should be doing to get your marketing, which is providing great care. That's continuity in its most measurable form. None of these are as clean or as visible as a star rating. In order to get to the answer, it's not a simple answer like a star rating. That's exactly why they matter more. The metrics that are easy to show off are usually the ones that have already been gained. The ones that are the harder to pull off are the ones that's actually happening.
Yeah. Anything you'd want to leave the audience with as we wrap up? Your parting thoughts?
No, just, not telling you not to do Google ratings. Just don't overvalue them, and don't spend all you're trying to get more of them. Reroute that same effort into something that brings meaningful change into the operations of your practice.
Yeah, I mean, as a guy who's spent some years in marketing and communications, the best marketing is a really, really great product and or service. 100%. If you're trying to become a better operator in healthcare, you're in the right place. If this episode hit, Larry goes deeper inside his writing. Look for The Operator on Substack. We'll also drop a link below. That's where the full breakdown lives. We'll see you next time.